Alrighty, hi there. My name is Ben Clark, and this is my Disruptive Innovation presentation for EDLD 583 Competency 1 Mastery Project. So I will be sharing a little bit about what disruptive innovation is, and then I'll introduce an example of disruptive innovation through a case study, talk a little bit about the gap analysis and where this disruptive innovation was able to fit into the larger market, talk about innovation outcomes, and then wrap up with a summary and overview. So, as a quick introduction to disruptive innovation, Bauer and Christensen defined disruptive innovation as the idea that smaller projects can take over larger industries by offering products that are maybe a little bit simpler, cheaper, or more convenient, and appealing to maybe a missed market. And then these smaller organizations, as they continue to grow and build out their product, so through development, they're able to disrupt the mainstream market and displace larger and maybe more established products and organizations. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about sustaining versus disrupting innovation and how the two are different. So starting with disruptive innovation, these are innovations that are smaller and more accessible to a potentially overlooked audience or customer set whose needs are not being met by the larger industry leaders, so those more well-known, bigger organizations. So some key characteristics of disruptive innovation are that they're innovations that tend to start out a little bit smaller and have a growth trajectory that takes place over time. And then these things can eventually improve their performance and outcomes to a point that might reshape an industry or redefine what expectations of those clientele or those customers are. Disrupting innovation is the opposite of sustaining innovation. So, sustaining innovation are when large organizations or products make improvements over time that might make specific products or technology better in the areas that are already mainstream and that already have a larger customer base and have value within the larger industry. And then sustaining also tends to keep companies or organizations competitive within their existing market. So if you think about disruptive innovation as being smaller with a larger growth trajectory versus sustaining innovation being smaller changes that you're making to an already popular or larger product, you see that disruptive innovation tends to outpace sustaining innovation over time. So, disruptive innovation that I want to introduce is MOOC, which is a massive open online course. So, talking about disruptive innovation in higher education, which is the setting that I work in, I wanted to talk about something that's maybe disrupted our field a little bit. So, MOOCs are massive open online courses, which are courses designed for accessibility and large scale participation. So MOOCs are often offered for free with optional like paid advancements, whether that's like a certificate program or additional access to features that might help you further develop the skills that you're learning from the free component. And then MOOCs are typically like a combination of self-paced, self-guided video lectures, readings, discussion forums, and then auto-graded assignments. So often in MOOCs, you don't actually have an instructor that you're working directly with. It's all kind of a self-guided learning system. So just to highlight some key characteristics of MOOCs, they're considered to be very flexible since you're doing a lot of that work on your own time. Typically all virtual, often structured for self-guided participation and considered to be a more accessible option than maybe traditional higher education settings. And then some popular examples of MOOCs in the current sphere. Coursera has gotten a lot of traction over the last couple of years, Khan Academy, and then there's a handful of other kind of emerging MOOC platforms as well. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of key points in MOOC development over time. In the early 2000s, universities started to utilize online resources and learning management systems. Platforms like Moodle or Blackboard were some of the earlier LMS programs that folks were using. Um, and this all kind of began gaining traction in alignment with an increase of broadband internet. Some more modernized LMS programs that we might see today include like Canvas. Blackboard is still pretty popular. Um, as those learning management systems started to become more popular, platform-based MOOCs started to emerge. There was a New York Times article by Laura Papano, who deemed 2012 kind of the year of the MOOC, citing that there was a launch of what are some now large-scale companies like Coursera and edX that were initially backed by some of the larger, more elite universities. And this year was considered to be kind of a global advancement of MOOCs and learning management systems as it largely increased course accessibility. So universities were finding that to be very beneficial, but this was kind of where some of those programs started to see some growth and launch from their own platforms. And then just a little bit of a note on where we are now. Credentialing and professionalization of MOOCs and these platforms like Coursera have become a lot more mainstream and popular. So rather than folks going on for advanced degrees or continuing their education through higher education, various business areas have found that credentialing is more of a modern approach to education and can add increased value to folks' professional development. So, getting some of those like micro badges or smaller certificates in very specific things has been a niche market that these MOOCs have been able to break into. So I just want to highlight a couple of things and characteristics of MOOCs that align them with disruptive innovation. In the early stages of MOOCs, they were very small scale and less intensive than a traditional university degree. And Formerly, they did not necessarily have any form of accreditation and had lower rates of follow through from participants in their early stages. This kind of highlights that like low performing accessible option that is meeting a market need that maybe some of the larger scale institutions or organizations aren't meeting, which is a key component of disruptive innovation. Then you have the target audience. So MOOCs were attractive to audience with limited access to higher education, whether that was based on limited financial means or lack of time. These were groups that were largely overlooked by universities and created an initial target audience for MOOCs. With added value, MOOCs were a very flexible option that allowed for self-paced participation at a free or low cost, and was initially more focused on the student experience. This also met a market need where folks had needs being addressed around accessibility challenges that were not being addressed by higher education. So supporting a need of that niche population. And then generally just like challenging educational norms, MOOCs challenge traditional university standards such as campus-based experiences, specific degree programs, and accreditation requirements. All things that were initially dismissed by higher education as an industry. So higher education was saying that there isn't value if you're not getting these campus-based experiences, these specific degree programs, and meeting accreditation requirements. So to me, that's one of the ways that MOOCs have largely been disruptive is that they have found this target audience that is looking for continued professional development, credentialing, advancement, and by dismissing that initially higher education missed an opportunity to capitalize on those needs that have now become increasingly popular amongst organizations and uh, developing professionals. So as a brief summary, again, MOOCs began as a low quality free alternative to populations that universities were not necessarily serving. Over time, the platforms grew and improved and gained partnerships that led to competitive or competition with traditional university settings. And then the programs addressed critical gaps in access, cost, and flexibility that folks were looking for. So I think MOOCs are a perfect example of a disruptive innovation that are still thriving today and have really shook up the higher education industry as a whole.